Before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let's dive. It was a cold, damp New Year's Eve, and the streets of Millhaven were eerily quiet. The town square, usually vibrant with festive decorations and celebrations, stood oddly empty this year. The local news blamed the weather, but Claire and her friends, Jake, Maya, and Eric, decided to ignore the warnings and gather at Claire's house. They joked that the lack of a crowd made their private party even better. Claire's house was an old, creaky Victorian she inherited from her grandmother. The large windows were frosted with ice, and the dim, flickering lights added a strange charm to the gathering. By 10 p.m., the group was deep into games and snacks when Claire's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She ignored it. Minutes later, everyone's phones rang simultaneously. "That's weird," Maya said, glancing at her screen. The call was from the same unknown number. When Claire answered hesitantly, a low, distorted voice whispered, 10, 9, 8. "What kind of prank is this?" Eric laughed nervously, but when Claire looked at her screen, the call had ended. Brushing it off as a spam call, the group continued their evening. By 10:30 p.m., they were halfway through a movie when the calls came again. This time, they didn't answer, but the voicemail notifications that followed sent chills down their spines. Each message contained the same whispering countdown. Claire replayed the voicemail on speaker. "It's a prank," Jake said. "Someone's probably spoofing our numbers. Relax." But then the power flickered. For a second, the entire house was plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, they noticed the front door was slightly ajar, letting in an icy draft. "Did you forget to lock it?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. Claire shook her head. "I'm sure I did." Jake closed the door firmly and turned the lock, but none of them could shake the unease settling in. As they checked the rest of the house, Claire's phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was a picture, a blurry image of them sitting in the living room, taken from outside the frosted window. They froze. Whoever was watching them was close. "Call the police," Eric whispered. But before Claire could dial, every phone in the house began ringing simultaneously again. Each screen flashed the same number. The ringing phones filled the room with a shrill, synchronized hum. Claire's hand trembled as she stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer or block the number. Jake grabbed his phone and swiped to accept the call. "Who is this?" Jake demanded, his voice wavering. For a moment, there was only static. Then, the same distorted voice broke through. 7, 6, 5. Jake hung up and threw his phone onto the couch. "I'm not playing this game," he said, pacing the room. Maya was glued to the spot, staring at her own screen as another voicemail notification popped up. She didn't dare listen. The group huddled together, tension thickening the air. Eric peered out the frosted window, squinting through the icy glass. "There's no one there," he said, though his tone was anything but confident. Just as Eric stepped away from the window, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate raps echoed through the house. They froze. "Who would be out in this weather?" Maya whispered, clutching Claire's arm. "We didn't invite anyone else." The knock came again, harder this time. Jake moved toward the door, but Claire grabbed his wrist. "Don't open it," she hissed. "We don't know who it is." Jake hesitated. Then, the doorknob began to turn, rattling violently as if someone on the other side was desperate to get in. Panic spread through the group, and Claire scrambled to find her phone to call the police. But as soon as she dialed, the line went dead. "Try the landline," Eric shouted, running toward the kitchen. Claire followed, but the line was just static, the receiver cold in her hands. Then, the lights flickered again before going out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, except for the faint blue glow from the snow-covered windows. The group regrouped in the living room, their breath visible in the freezing air. "We need to leave," Maya whispered. "This isn't normal." As they debated their next move, Claire's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call or voicemail. It was another picture. She held up the phone to show the group, her face pale. The image was of them in the darkened living room, but now there was a 5th figure standing in the corner. "What is that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. They turned toward the corner, but it was empty. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Then the countdown began again. Not on their phones, but out loud. A deep guttural voice echoed through the house. 4, 3... The countdown voice echoed in their ears, low and menacing, growing louder with each number. The friends huddled together, the room so silent they could hear the creak of the old house settling around them. "Who's there?" Claire shouted into the darkness, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the oppressive weight of silence. Jake grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass candlestick, and moved toward the corner where the figure had appeared in the photo. "Jake, don't!" Maya pleaded, clutching Claire's arm. But he didn't listen. He swung the candlestick into the empty shadows with all his strength. It connected with nothing but air, the sound of metal hitting plaster reverberating through the room. "See?" Jake said, his voice strained. "There's no one here. This is just..." Before he could finish, all their phones buzzed at once. This time, the message wasn't a voicemail or a call. It was a video. Claire hesitated, but her curiosity won out. She tapped the screen. The video showed a grainy night vision recording of them sitting in the living room just moments ago. As they watched, a shadowy figure slowly stepped into the frame, standing directly behind Jake. The figure's face was obscured, but its shape was unmistakable, tall, angular, and wrong. Jake turned toward the spot where the figure had been in the video. It was still empty. "This has to be fake," he muttered, but his hands shook as he set the candlestick down. "Fake or not, we're leaving," Eric said, his voice firm. He grabbed his coat and motioned for the others to follow. "We'll go to my place and call for help there." But when they opened the door, they froze. The snow-covered street was no longer empty. Footprints crisscrossed the ground, circling the house in looping, nonsensical patterns. Whoever, or whatever, had left them seemed to have been pacing for hours. "Did someone follow us here?" Maya whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. Claire pulled out her phone to take a picture of the footprints, but the screen glitched and went black before she could snap the shot. "What the hell is going on?" she murmured, frustration and fear creeping into her voice. As they debated their next move, another sound broke the stillness, a rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. Tap, tap, tap. They all turned toward the staircase, the darkened hallway above stretching like a gaping mouth. "No way," Maya whispered, backing away. "We're not going up there." But the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped altogether, replaced by a faint creak of footsteps moving toward the edge of the landing. "Someone's upstairs," Eric said, gripping the back of a chair for support. "We need to get out, now." But as they turned back to the door, they realized it was already too late. The countdown voice started again, this time, right behind them. 2 dots. The voice was closer now, unmistakably in the room with them. All 4 spun around, their breath catching in their throats. But the room was empty. Only the flickering shadows cast by the blue glow of the snow outside danced on the walls. Jake, now visibly shaking, lunged for the front door. He yanked on the knob, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked!" he yelled, twisting and pulling with all his might. Claire rushed to help him, her fingers fumbling with the deadbolt. "It's not locked," she insisted. "It's stuck!" Panic edged into her voice as the two of them strained against the door. Behind them, Eric grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, but instead of falling apart, the shards froze mid-air, suspended like a spider's web of jagged ice. The opening instantly frosted over, the view of the snowy street obscured by a thick, impenetrable glaze. "What the hell is this?" Eric shouted, backing away from the window. The temperature in the house dropped further, their breaths now visible in steady clouds. Claire's phone buzzed in her hand again, and she hesitated before looking at the screen. This time, it was a live stream. The camera's perspective was their own. Someone was watching them from inside the house. The frame shifted slightly, showing the 4 of them huddled near the door. But then, the perspective moved closer, as if whoever held the camera was walking toward them. "It's coming from upstairs," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. She dropped the phone, and it landed face up, still streaming. From the speakers, they heard the faint sound of footsteps descending the stairs. "Run!" Maya whispered. Her voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes. "Run where?" Jake shot back, his voice panicked. "The door won't open. The windows won't break. We're trapped." Before anyone could respond, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the live stream. They glanced toward the staircase, expecting to see the figure from the video, but it wasn't there. Instead, Claire screamed. Her dropped phone now displayed a new image, the door they were standing in front of, taken just seconds ago, with an ominous shadow visible behind them. Claire spun around, but there was nothing there. Yet the icy chill at her back felt all too real, as if the shadow itself was breathing down her neck. "Everyone stay together," Eric said, his voice firm despite his trembling hands. "We'll go upstairs. If this thing's playing games, we'll face it head on." "No!" Maya cried. "We can't go up there. That's where it started. That's where it's leading us." But the lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, they saw a shape, tall, gaunt, and featureless, standing at the top of the stairs. The lights blinked out, and when they came back, it was gone. The group stood frozen in silence, staring at the staircase. The figure they had seen moments ago was gone, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on them. "We don't have a choice," Eric said finally, breaking the silence. "If we stay down here, we're sitting ducks. We need to find another way out." Reluctantly, they began ascending the creaking stairs, their footsteps slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with every step, their breaths puffing in clouds that quickly dissipated. The wooden banister felt icy to the touch, as if the chill had seeped into the very bones of the house. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness. The group clung to each other, peering into the shadows. There were 3 doors, one on the left, one on the right, and one at the end of the hall. All were closed, and each seemed to emanate a faint, unnatural cold. "Which one?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "The one at the end," Jake said, pointing. "If this thing wants us to go somewhere, it's probably leading us there." "Or it's a trap," Maya shot back, but she followed anyway. They crept down the hallway, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. When they reached the final door, Claire hesitated before turning the knob. The door swung open easily, revealing an empty room bathed in faint moonlight from a single frost-covered window. The furniture was old and covered in dust sheets, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. "What now?" Jake asked, stepping into the room. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, separating him from the others. Claire screamed and tried to wrench the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Inside the room, Jake spun around, pounding on the door. "It won't open," he shouted, his voice muffled through the thick wood. As the others struggled to free him, he turned toward the window, his eyes widening in terror. Outside, the street was gone. Instead, the view showed a sprawling, barren field under a starless sky. The frost on the window began to melt, revealing something worse, a reflection of the room behind him. But in the reflection, he wasn't alone. "Let me out!" Jake yelled, but his voice cracked as he felt a cold hand brush against his neck. He whipped around, swinging blindly, but there was nothing there. The rocking chair in the corner began to creak, moving slowly back and forth on its own. Outside the door, the group could hear Jake's frantic screams. Suddenly, the countdown voice returned, louder than ever, reverberating through the house. 1 dot. The voice reverberated through the house, louder and more guttural than before. Jake's muffled screams grew frantic, and the pounding on the door intensified. "Get me out of here!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. Claire and Eric threw their combined weight against the door, but it wouldn't budge. Maya stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her wide eyes fixed on the frosted window at the end of the hallway. She could swear she saw something moving outside, something tall and skeletal, pacing back and forth in the snow. "Jake!" Claire screamed, slamming her fists against the wood. Inside the room, Jake's cries abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the empty moonlit room. "Jake!" Claire whispered, stepping cautiously inside. The rocking chair creaked to a stop. There was no sign of him, no indication he'd ever been there. The frost on the window had melted completely, but the view outside was even stranger. It no longer showed the snowy street or even the barren field. Instead, it depicted the group standing in the hallway, their faces pale and horrified. "Where is he?" Maya stammered, clutching Eric's arm. "What happened to him?" Before anyone could answer, the air grew heavy, the atmosphere pressing down on them like a weight. The countdown voice returned, but this time it was a whisper, close and intimate, as if it came from directly behind their ears. 0. The ground beneath their feet shuddered, and the lights flickered violently before going out entirely. The hallway plunged into pitch blackness. Claire fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, but something was wrong. The hallway had changed. Instead of the creaky wood-paneled walls, they stood in a narrow concrete corridor lined with metal doors. Each door bore a scratched-in number, the digits glowing faintly in the dark. The numbers weren't in order. They jumped randomly, 12, 5, 19, 2, like pieces of a puzzle they couldn't solve. "What is this place?" Maya whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Eric approached one of the doors, running his hand over the cold metal. "It's like some kind of maze," he said. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't move. Then came the laughter. A low, guttural chuckle echoed through the corridor, bouncing off the walls. It grew louder, more manic, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Claire whipped her flashlight toward the sound, but it revealed only an empty hallway stretching endlessly in both directions. "Run!" Claire shouted, grabbing Maya's arm. They bolted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing behind them. The laughter followed, growing louder, closer, as if it were chasing them. The numbers on the doors blurred as they ran, the glowing digits swirling into incomprehensible patterns. Suddenly, Eric tripped, sprawling onto the cold concrete floor. Claire and Maya skidded to a stop, turning back to help him. But as they reached out to pull him up, the ground beneath him cracked open. "Eric!" Maya screamed as he was dragged downward by a black, inky substance that seemed to move with a mind of its own. His screams were cut short as the fissure sealed itself, leaving no trace. Claire and Maya were alone now. The corridor was silent again, save for their ragged breathing. The faint glow of the door numbers illuminated their terrified faces as they realized there was no way out. Then, from the darkness behind them, the countdown voice began again. 10, 9, 8. The voice grew louder, each number reverberating through the concrete corridor like a drumbeat signaling doom. Claire and Maya clung to each other, their breaths shallow and rapid as they scanned the endless hallway for an escape. "We can't stay here," Claire whispered, pulling Maya to her feet. "We have to move." Maya shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There's nowhere to go. We're trapped." The laughter returned, a guttural, mocking sound that echoed from every direction. Claire tightened her grip on Maya's arm and began running, dragging her along the corridor. The glowing numbers on the doors seemed to pulse as they passed, flickering like dying stars. The corridor twisted and turned unnaturally, as if the walls themselves were alive and shifting. Every time they thought they reached the end, the path stretched further, looping back on itself. Claire's flashlight began to flicker, its beam growing weaker with each step. "Stop!" Maya cried, pulling Claire to a halt. Her voice was hoarse and desperate. "We're going in circles. This isn't real." Claire turned to face her, but before she could respond, the air around them grew heavy and the floor began to rumble. The countdown voice returned, louder and more distorted than ever. 7, 6, 5. Claire's flashlight died completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. For a moment, there was silence, then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. "Who's there?" Claire shouted into the void, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. A faint blue glow began to emanate from the walls, revealing the shadowy figure that loomed just feet away. It was tall and grotesque, its elongated limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or lack thereof, was a smooth, featureless void. The figure raised a hand, pointing at the door directly in front of Claire and Maya. Its glowing number, 0, burned brighter than the others, casting a harsh light that made them squint. "That's it," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the way out." "No!" Maya screamed, pulling away. "It's leading us into a trap. Don't you see? It wants us to go in there." Claire hesitated, her mind racing. But the figure began to move closer, its slow, deliberate steps sending vibrations through the floor. They had no choice. Claire grabbed Maya's hand and yanked her toward the door. The moment they touched the handle, the world around them shifted violently. The concrete walls cracked and crumbled, revealing an endless void of swirling shadows. Maya screamed as the ground beneath them gave way, and they plunged into the darkness. The countdown voice followed them into the abyss, finishing its final numbers. 4, 3, 2, 1. When Claire opened her eyes, she was back in her living room. The frost on the windows was gone, the lights were on, and the familiar sound of the New Year's Eve countdown played on the television. But the room was empty. Maya, Eric, and Jake were nowhere to be found. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was a photo, a picture of her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. But in the reflection of the darkened window behind her, the shadowy figure loomed, its hand reaching for her shoulder. The phone buzzed again, and a single message appeared on the screen. Happy New Year. Millhaven Apartments had stood for nearly a century, a grandiose relic of a bygone era. Once the crown jewel of the town, the building had fallen into disrepair over the decades, its halls echoing with the whispers of forgotten tenants. When Alex and Emily moved into Unit 304 on New Year's Eve, they were thrilled by the apartment's vintage charm. The landlord had shrugged off their questions about why the unit had been vacant for so long, muttering only that the building had its quirks. By 8 p.m., Alex and Emily had unpacked just enough to make the place feel like home. Emily hung streamers in the living room, while Alex tinkered with the thermostat, trying to chase away the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. The party they'd planned was small, just the two of them, and a bottle of champagne. As Alex lit the last candle, the power abruptly cut out. "That's not great timing," Alex said, grabbing his phone for light. Emily frowned and walked to the window. The streetlights outside were still on, their orange glow cutting through the falling snow. "It's just us," she said, her voice uneasy. They checked the breaker box, but everything seemed fine. When Alex called the landlord, his phone went straight to voicemail. "It's probably just old wiring," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's not let it ruin our night." By 9 p.m., the candles had burned low, and the cold had settled deeper into the apartment. Emily pulled a blanket around her shoulders. As they sat on the couch, trying to distract themselves with stories of their childhood New Year's traditions, a sound interrupted their laughter, a soft, rhythmic tapping. "Is someone at the door?" Emily asked. Alex shook his head. "It's coming from inside the wall." They both stared at the faded wallpaper, the tapping growing louder, more deliberate. Alex stood and placed his ear against the wall, then jerked back as the tapping stopped abruptly. "Old pipes," he said, but his voice was less certain now. They tried to ignore it, but minutes later, the tapping resumed, this time from the opposite side of the room. It moved slowly, methodically, as if circling them. "Maybe we should leave," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound. Before Alex could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, the screen glowing brightly in the darkness. It was a text message, but there was no name attached, just a series of numbers. 12:01, leave before it's too late. Alex stared at his phone, the cryptic text message illuminating his worried expression. "Who sent this?" Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. Alex didn't answer. He was too busy scrolling through his contacts. There was no name associated with the number, and the timestamp on the message read 12:01 a.m., still hours away. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," Alex said, though his tone lacked conviction. Emily frowned. "Who would prank us? We don't even know anyone here yet." The tapping in the walls had stopped, leaving the apartment unnervingly silent. Alex set his phone down and tried to focus on calming Emily. "Look, the landlord will probably have this fixed tomorrow. Let's just stay bundled up and try to enjoy our night." Emily nodded reluctantly, but the unease in her eyes didn't fade. At 10 p.m., the sound returned. Not tapping this time, but a slow, deliberate scratching, as if someone were dragging sharp nails across the walls. Emily clutched Alex's arm. "That's not pipes." Alex grabbed a flashlight from one of the moving boxes and shone it along the walls. The light caught something, a small bulge beneath the wallpaper that hadn't been there before. He moved closer, his breath fogging in the cold air. The bulge seemed to pulse slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. "Don't," Emily said, backing away. But Alex reached out, his fingers brushing against the wallpaper. As soon as he touched it, the scratching stopped, replaced by a new sound, a faint ticking. The ticking was slow and steady, echoing faintly through the apartment. Alex stepped back, shining the flashlight across the room. The sound was coming from the kitchen. "I'll check it out," Alex said, his voice trembling. Emily followed him hesitantly, holding the edge of the blanket tight around her shoulders. When they reached the kitchen, Alex froze. On the counter sat an old-fashioned wind-up clock they hadn't unpacked. Its brass surface was tarnished, the glass over the clock face cracked. The second hand ticked steadily, though neither of them had wound it. "Where did this come from?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Alex said. He reached out to pick it up, but as soon as his fingers touched the clock, the ticking stopped. In the silence that followed, the rhythmic tapping began again, this time from the ceiling. Alex and Emily turned their eyes upward, dread pooling in their stomachs. "The upstairs apartment is empty, right?" Emily asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yeah," Alex said. "The landlord said no one's lived there in years." The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to follow a pattern now, like someone walking back and forth across the floor above. Then, suddenly, it stopped, and a new noise took its place. The sound of footsteps descending the staircase outside their door. The footsteps outside their door were deliberate, each one sending vibrations through the floor. Emily clutched Alex's arm, her knuckles white. "Someone's out there," she whispered. Alex grabbed the flashlight and motioned for her to stay back. He approached the door cautiously, every step feeling like a mile. As he reached the peephole, he hesitated. Taking a deep breath, he leaned forward and peered through it. The hallway was empty. "Nothing," Alex said, his voice shaky. "There's no one there." "No, I heard it," Emily insisted, moving closer. But before she could reach the door, a loud bang reverberated through the apartment, as if someone had slammed against the wall just outside. The noise was followed by silence so thick it felt suffocating. Alex backed away from the door, his heart pounding. "Maybe we should leave," he said, grabbing his coat. Emily didn't need convincing. They hurried toward the door, but as Alex turned the knob, it refused to budge. "It's locked," he muttered, twisting harder. "You didn't lock it," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. Alex yanked harder, but the door wouldn't move. It felt like something heavy was pressing against it from the other side. Then the ticking started again. Emily spun around, her eyes darting to the kitchen counter where the wind-up clock had been. It was gone. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, where faint scratch marks had begun to appear in the plaster, forming jagged, looping shapes. "Do you see that?" Alex asked, his voice barely audible. The looping scratches began to take on a shape, a figure, long and distorted, as if someone had dragged a stick across the plaster in an effort to draw something humanoid. Emily grabbed his hand. "We need to find another way out," she said. "Now." They turned toward the windows, but the frost on the glass was so thick it was opaque. Alex grabbed a chair and smashed it against the pane. Instead of shattering, the glass fractured into a spiderweb of frost, the patterns twisting and spiraling unnaturally. The cracks glowed faintly blue in the dark. "This can't be happening," Alex muttered, stepping back. The frost began to melt, revealing a figure standing just outside. The figure didn't move, its outline sharp against the backdrop of the snowy street. Alex and Emily froze, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Then the figure raised a hand and pointed toward the door. As if on cue, the tapping resumed, this time coming from the hallway. It was slow and rhythmic, moving closer with each beat. Emily backed away, her eyes darting between the door and the window. "What does it want?" she whispered. Before Alex could answer, the doorknob began to turn on its own. The doorknob turned slowly, the metallic creak echoing through the apartment. Emily clung to Alex, her heart pounding in her chest. The door shuddered, but it didn't open all the way. Instead, it stopped halfway, revealing a sliver of the dimly lit hallway beyond. Alex raised the flashlight and aimed it toward the gap, but the beam flickered and dimmed, barely penetrating the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No response. The hallway was silent, but the cold seeped in through the open door, a chill that felt alive, wrapping around them like an icy grip. Emily's breath hitched as she noticed something on the floor, a single footprint, wet and dark, leading into their apartment. "Alex," Emily whispered, pulling him back. Close it now." Alex hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Before he could move, a sound broke the silence, a faint humming, soft and melodic, coming from the hallway. It was a woman's voice, singing a song neither of them recognized. "Hello?" Alex called out again, louder this time. "It's just someone messing with us," Alex said, though his voice lacked conviction. He moved to close the door, but as he pushed it shut, it resisted. It was as if something was holding it open from the other side. Alex stepped back, and the door creaked open again, this time all the way. The flashlight flickered back to life, casting a pale beam into the hallway. The walls were lined with deep scratches, long and jagged, as if something had been clawing at them for years. At the far end of the hallway, a faint blue light glowed, flickering like a dying bulb. Alex and Emily exchanged a glance. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Alex said, "but it wasn't there before." The light pulsed faintly, casting shifting shadows along the walls. As Alex and Emily stared, the light began to move, floating closer, its glow growing brighter with every second. "Close the door," Emily urged, backing away. But Alex stood frozen, his eyes locked on the approaching light. The faint humming returned, louder this time, echoing down the corridor. Then, without warning, the light stopped. It hovered in place for a moment, before splitting into 3 smaller orbs that floated toward the apartment. Alex slammed the door shut, but the instant it clicked into place, the sound of tapping resumed, louder and faster than before. The tapping on the door became frantic, each knock rattling the frame. Emily grabbed Alex's arm. "It's not going to stop," she said, her voice barely audible over the relentless pounding. Suddenly, the sound ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence. Alex and Emily exchanged nervous glances, but before they could react, a new sound filled the air. A low creaking noise, as if the apartment itself was shifting. The walls seemed to groan, and the floor under their feet vibrated faintly. "What's happening?" Emily whispered, stepping back. The tapping resumed, but this time it came from inside the apartment. Emily turned toward the living room, her eyes widening as she saw the wind-up clock sitting on the coffee table, ticking loudly despite having disappeared earlier. "It was gone," Emily stammered. "I saw it disappear." Alex approached the clock cautiously, his flashlight illuminating its tarnished surface. As he reached out to touch it, the ticking stopped abruptly, replaced by a loud crack from the wall behind them. They turned to see deep fissures spreading across the wallpaper, the cracks glowing faintly blue. The air grew colder, and the blue light from the cracks began to pulse rhythmically, matching the ticking of the clock. The apartment groaned again, the walls shifting subtly as if the room were alive. "Is it moving?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Alex grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen. "We need to get out of here, now." The kitchen looked different than it had before. The cabinets were warped, the appliances rusted, and the frost-covered windows now bore long scratch marks, as if something had clawed at the glass. The door to the hallway was gone, replaced by another wall with more glowing cracks. "We're trapped," Emily said, her voice breaking. "There's no way out." Alex shone his flashlight around the room, searching for anything that could help. His beam landed on a new door that hadn't been there before, its surface old and splintered. "That wasn't there earlier," he said. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a staircase leading downward into darkness. A faint, cold wind blew up from the stairs, carrying with it a soft humming, the same eerie melody they had heard earlier. Emily shook her head. "We can't go down there." "We don't have a choice," Alex said. He stepped toward the staircase, his flashlight barely illuminating the first few steps. The light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, making it impossible to see how far down the stairs went. The humming grew louder as they stood at the threshold. Alex turned to Emily, his face pale. "Are you coming?" Emily hesitated, but when the tapping on the walls resumed, faster and more frantic than ever, she nodded. Together, they descended into the darkness. The staircase spiraled downward, its wooden steps creaking under their weight. The faint blue glow from the apartment above faded as they descended, replaced by an oppressive darkness. Alex held the flashlight steady, but its beam barely pierced the inky black, as if the light itself were being swallowed. The humming grew louder with every step, weaving an eerie melody that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. Emily clung to Alex, her breath shallow and rapid. "Where do you think this leads?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Alex replied, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. The walls around them were rough and uneven, lined with deep scratches that seemed to move and shift in the flickering light. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom. The staircase opened into a cavernous space, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. The air was damp and cold, and the floor beneath their feet was uneven stone, slick with moisture. In the center of the room stood a single object, the wind-up clock. "It's here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The clock ticked steadily, its sound amplified in the vast emptiness of the room. Alex approached it cautiously, the flashlight beam casting long shadows across the stone walls. As he got closer, he noticed something etched into the ground around the clock, a circle of symbols, strange and indecipherable, glowing faintly blue. "What is this?" he muttered, crouching down for a closer look. Emily stayed back, her eyes darting around the room. "I don't like this," she said. "We need to leave." Before Alex could respond, the ticking stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an eerie silence. Then, a new sound emerged, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around them. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice rising with panic. Alex didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the clock, which had begun to shake violently. The glowing symbols around it pulsed with an unnatural light, growing brighter with each pulse. The growl grew louder, and a shadow began to coalesce in the corner of the room. It was tall and twisted, its form barely human. Emily screamed, backing away as the shadow moved closer, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. "Alex!" Emily shouted, but he was frozen in place, his eyes locked on the figure. The shadow stretched toward him, its long, claw-like fingers reaching for his chest. In a surge of desperation, Emily grabbed the clock and hurled it against the wall. The clock shattered, and the room was immediately plunged into chaos. The blue light flared brightly, blinding them, and the growling turned into a deafening roar. The ground beneath their feet began to crack and shift, and the shadowy figure let out a piercing scream before dissolving into the air. Emily grabbed Alex's arm, pulling him toward the staircase. "We have to go, now!" she yelled. Together, they stumbled back up the steps as the room below collapsed into darkness. The staircase groaned beneath their weight as Alex and Emily scrambled upward, the collapsing room below sending vibrations through the wooden steps. The blue light faded into darkness, but the distant roar of the shadowy figure echoed after them, growing fainter with each step. "Don't stop!" Emily shouted, pulling Alex forward. The air grew colder as they ascended, and their breath came in ragged, visible puffs. Finally, they reached the top, but the doorway they had entered through was gone. Instead, they faced a solid wall of frost-covered stone. "No," Alex muttered, pounding his fists against the cold surface. "No! No! No!" Emily looked around frantically, her eyes darting to the walls. A faint blue glow appeared, pulsing like a heartbeat, spreading cracks across the stone. The apartment's familiar wallpaper seemed to seep through, merging with the frost and stone in a surreal, shifting pattern. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered. The humming had returned, softer now, almost melodic. It filled the air around them, growing louder with each pulse of the blue light. Alex stepped back, watching as the cracks in the wall widened, revealing glimpses of their apartment beyond. "It's breaking," he said. "We can get through." Using his flashlight, Alex struck the wall with all his strength. The cracks splintered further, and a piece of the stone crumbled away, revealing the familiar living room. Emily joined him, clawing at the edges until the hole was large enough to crawl through. They tumbled into the apartment, the warm light of the candles still flickering faintly. For a moment, everything seemed normal, silent, still, and cold. Alex helped Emily to her feet, their breaths steadying as they surveyed the room. The wind-up clock was gone, and the scratches on the walls had faded. "Did we stop it?" Emily asked cautiously. Before Alex could answer, the humming returned, louder than ever. They turned toward the kitchen, where the frost on the window began to creep inward, covering the walls and floor in a rapid wave of ice. The temperature plummeted, and the light of the candles extinguished in an instant. "It's still here," Alex whispered. The apartment groaned again, the walls shifting as shadows began to pool in the corners. A single, faint ticking sound emerged, growing louder with every second. Emily backed away, her eyes locked on the frost-covered kitchen door, where a tall, distorted shadow now loomed. "We have to leave," Emily said, her voice breaking. Alex nodded, but when they turned to the front door, they froze. The door was wide open, revealing not the hallway, but the spiraling staircase they had just escaped. The shadowy figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Alex grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward the staircase. "We have to try," he said, his voice trembling. They sprinted down the steps, but this time the staircase didn't end. It spiraled endlessly downward, the shadow's presence following close behind. The humming grew louder, the cold deeper, until the staircase itself began to crumble beneath their feet. As the last step gave way, they fell into a blinding blue light. Their screams echoed through the void, but the sound was swallowed by the light, leaving nothing but silence. When Alex opened his eyes, he was alone. The apartment was quiet and empty, the frost gone. The candles flickered softly on the table, and the clock sat in its place, ticking steadily. But Emily was nowhere to be seen. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from the same unknown number. "Happy New Year, welcome home." It was a New Year's Eve tradition for Sarah, Chris, and their close-knit group of friends to rent a secluded cabin in the woods. They'd been doing it for years, and every time, it felt like the perfect escape. No cell service, no interruptions, just good company and the promise of a fresh start. This year, they were 7, but as the group piled into the cabin and began unpacking, it became clear someone was missing. Rachel, Chris's girlfriend, hadn't arrived yet. "She said she'd be here by 6, Chris muttered, pacing in front of the fireplace. The snow outside was falling harder now, and the winding road leading to the cabin was already buried in white. "She probably got delayed," Sarah offered. "The weather's awful. She'll be fine." By 8 p.m., the group had tried calling Rachel's phone multiple times, but the calls wouldn't connect. "No signal," Chris muttered, his voice tight with worry. "What if she's stuck out there?" The others tried to reassure Chris, but an unspoken tension filled the room. The crackling fire did little to chase away the growing chill in the air, and the wind howled against the windows like a restless spirit. They agreed to wait another hour before taking action. Surely Rachel would show up by then. At 9 p.m., Chris decided he couldn't wait any longer. "I'm going to look for her," he said, grabbing his coat. Sarah and Jake offered to join him, but Chris insisted on going alone. "She'll recognize my car. I'll take the road down toward the highway and see if I can find her." The group reluctantly agreed. As Chris pulled on his boots, Sarah grabbed his arm. "If you're not back in an hour, we're coming after you," she said firmly. Chris left, the sound of his car engine fading into the distance. The remaining 6 sat in silence, the occasional pop of the firewood, the only sound in the room. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters. Jake broke the silence with a weak joke, but no one laughed. Then, at 9:45 p.m., the group heard a loud knock at the door. Sarah jumped up, a wave of relief washing over her. "It's probably Rachel," she said, hurrying to the door. But when she opened it, no one was there, just the howling wind and the blanket of untouched snow on the porch. "Who was it?" Jake asked from the couch. Sarah stared out into the darkness, her stomach knotting. "No one," she said softly. "There's no one out there." The door creaked as she closed it, and the group exchanged uneasy glances. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the sound of the wind and the faint echo of the knock still ringing in their ears. The group sat in uneasy silence after the knock. Sarah tried to shake it off as a fluke, perhaps the wind rattling the door, but the others weren't so sure. Jake got up and peered out the window. "There's nothing out there," he said. "No footprints, no tracks. How could anyone knock and just disappear?" The question lingered, unanswered. Sarah walked back to the couch, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "Maybe Chris came back, saw Rachel, and went after her on foot," she suggested, though her voice betrayed her doubt. By 10:15 p.m., the unease in the cabin had grown unbearable. The wind outside was relentless, and strange creaks echoed through the walls. Sarah finally stood. "I can't sit here anymore. I'm going out to check the porch." Jake and Mia followed her, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they stepped outside. The cold bit at their faces, and the snow crunched under their boots. They scanned the area, but as Jake had said earlier, there were no footprints near the door. Mia pointed toward the edge of the porch. "Wait, what's that?" she asked. Sarah knelt down and squinted. There, just beyond the edge of the steps, were faint, uneven tracks in the snow. They didn't look like boot prints, more like long, shallow grooves, as if something had been dragged across the ground. "Those aren't Chris's," Sarah whispered, her stomach knotting. "And they're heading toward the woods." Jake shone his flashlight toward the tree line. The light illuminated nothing but dense, swaying branches. "Whatever made those tracks, it's gone now," he said, his voice low. The three of them hurried back inside, slamming the door behind them. The others were waiting, their faces pale with worry. "Did you see anything?" Ellie asked. "Tracks," Sarah said, catching her breath. "But not Chris's, something else." The room fell silent again. Sarah paced near the fireplace, her mind racing. Chris had been gone for over an hour now, and Rachel still hadn't shown up. "What if they're lost out there?" she said. "We should go look for them." "You saw those tracks," Jake replied. "Do you really want to be out there right now?" Before anyone could respond, another knock echoed through the cabin, louder this time, more insistent. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the door. Sarah motioned for everyone to stay back and approach cautiously. She peered through the peephole, her heart hammering in her chest. Nothing. But as she turned the lock, a chill ran down her spine. A faint sound came from the other side of the door, a low, raspy whisper. She pressed her ear closer, trying to make it out. "Sarah, don't—" Mia started, but it was too late. Sarah opened the door, and the wind howled into the cabin. Standing on the porch was a single, snow-covered boot. Chris's boot. Sarah gasped and looked around, but the porch was empty. The tracks in the snow had vanished, erased by the wind. She picked up the boot with trembling hands, her breath visible in the freezing air. Behind her, Jake's flashlight flickered and went out. Sarah slammed the door shut, clutching Chris's boot as if it could somehow offer an explanation. "This can't be real," she whispered. "He wouldn't leave this behind." Mia wrapped a blanket around herself, her face pale. "What if he's hurt? What if he dropped it and tried to get back here?" Her voice trembled, barely masking the fear that was spreading through the group. The storm outside had intensified, snow battering the windows and rattling the shutters. Jake relit the fireplace, his hands shaking as he added more wood. "We need to think logically," he said. "If Chris got lost, he'd try to find shelter. Maybe he made it to Rachel's car." Sarah wasn't listening. She stared at the boot, running her fingers over the worn leather. Something was wrong. The boot was damp with melted snow, but the snow outside was so thick it should have been frozen solid. It didn't make sense. "Someone needs to go after him," Sarah said suddenly, standing up. "We can't just sit here." Jake shook his head. "You saw the tracks. There's something out there, and it's not Chris. We can't just go running into the woods in a storm." "Then what do we do?" Ellie snapped, her voice cracking. "Wait here and hope whatever's out there doesn't come back?" As they argued, the wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost deafening. The cabin groaned under the pressure, and the lights flickered before dimming to a faint, unreliable glow. Then the sound came. A single muffled thud, as if something heavy had landed on the roof. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the ceiling. The thud was followed by faint, deliberate creaks, as if someone, or something, was walking across the roof. "No," Mia whispered, backing away toward the fire. "This isn't happening." Jake grabbed the flashlight, but the beam sputtered and died as he pointed it toward the ceiling. "It's probably just a branch," he said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Sarah wasn't convinced. She grabbed a second flashlight and moved toward the front door. "I'm going outside," she said. "Are you insane?" Jake hissed, grabbing her arm. "You'll freeze to death or worse." "I need to know," Sarah interrupted. She pulled free of his grip and stepped outside into the storm. The snow hit her face like shards of ice, but she pushed forward, shining her flashlight toward the roof. Her heart stopped. Something was crouched on the roof, its body unnaturally long and thin. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. Sarah stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking as she scrambled to get back inside. The creature didn't follow, but its glowing eyes lingered, watching her retreat. As she slammed the door shut behind her, the thud came again, louder this time, as if the creature had jumped off the roof. The growl echoed once more, then faded into the howling wind. Sarah leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's not human," she stammered, her eyes wide with terror. "There's something out there." The group huddled around her, their faces pale. "What did you see?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Something on the roof, Sarah said. It was watching me. It knows we're here. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them. The wind outside howled, but it couldn't drown out the heavy, suffocating fear that filled the cabin. We can't stay here, Jake finally said, his voice low. If it's out there, we need to leave. Now. Leave and go where? Ellie snapped. We're in the middle of nowhere. Chris is still out there, and we have no idea where Rachel is. Jake grabbed a map from the counter and spread it out on the table. There's an old hiking trail not far from here, he said, pointing to a thin dotted line leading toward a ranger station. If we can make it there, we might find help. Sarah nodded, clutching her flashlight tightly. We can't just sit here and wait to be picked off. We leave now, together. Reluctantly, the group bundled up in their warmest clothes and gathered what little gear they had: flashlights, a first aid kit, and a few snacks. The snowstorm outside was relentless, but staying in the cabin no longer felt like an option. As they stepped out into the storm, the wind bit at their faces, and the snow swallowed their boots with every step. Jake led the way, the map clutched in one hand, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick snowfall. The trail was barely visible under the snow, but Jake pressed on, his determination unshaken. The others followed closely, their eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to shift among the trees. Every snap of a branch or gust of wind made them jump, their fear mounting with each step. After nearly an hour of walking, the group stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, weathered signpost, its letters faded and nearly illegible. Jake shone his flashlight on the sign, revealing the words, Ranger Station, 2 miles, scrawled in peeling paint. But there was something else beneath the sign. Tracks. Deep, uneven grooves in the snow, like the ones they had seen outside the cabin. The tracks led away from the trail and disappeared into the dense forest. Those aren't animal tracks, Mia whispered, her voice shaking. They're something else. Keep moving, Jake urged, his voice tight with fear. We're close now. But as the group started forward again, the wind carried a new sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all around them. It wasn't human, but it was close enough to send chills down their spines. Don't stop, Sarah urged, her flashlight shaking in her hand. We're almost there. The wail grew louder, echoing through the forest as if the trees themselves were crying out. And then, from the corner of her eye, Sarah saw it. A figure moving through the trees, its long, distorted limbs blending with the shadows. Sarah froze, her flashlight trembling as she tried to focus on the figure moving through the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, almost like they were stretching to match the swaying branches. She blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. What is it? Jake asked, noticing her hesitation. Something's out there, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. I saw it. The group stopped in their tracks, their flashlights darting wildly through the trees. The wail that had followed them moments ago faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Don't stop, Jake said firmly. If we stay here, we're sitting ducks. Reluctantly, they pressed on, the path ahead barely distinguishable under the thick blanket of snow. The ranger station had to be close. Every step felt heavier than the last, their exhaustion mingling with the suffocating fear that gripped them. Then, Ellie stumbled and fell to her knees. I can't, she gasped. I can't go any further. Mia crouched beside her, trying to help her up. We have to keep moving, she said. We can't stop now. As they argued, the sound of crunching snow echoed behind them. Sarah turned, her flashlight sweeping across the path they had just walked. At first, there was nothing. Then, a second crunch, closer this time. Something's following us, Sarah hissed, her voice barely audible. Jake turned, his flashlight catching movement just beyond the trees. For a brief moment, they all saw it. A figure crouched low to the ground, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Its limbs twitched unnaturally, as if it were deciding whether to approach. Run, Jake whispered, his voice sharp with fear. Run now! The group bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they stumbled through the snow. The trail grew steeper, the snow deeper, but they didn't dare stop. Behind them, the sound of crunching snow grew louder, faster, as whatever was following them gave chase. They burst into another clearing, their breaths ragged, their legs burning. In the center stood a small, dilapidated structure, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. A single sign above the door read, Ranger Station. "Get inside," Jake shouted, pushing open the creaking door. They stumbled into the station, slamming the door shut behind them. The interior was dark and freezing, the air stale and suffocating. Mia fumbled with her flashlight, illuminating the space. The station was small, with a desk, a radio, and a cot shoved into one corner. Snow had blown in through a broken window, and frost coated the walls. "Are we safe?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The answer came in the form of a low growl, resonating from just outside the door. The growl outside the door sent a fresh wave of terror through the group. Sarah pressed her ear against the wooden frame, trying to gauge how close it was. The sound was guttural, feral, and unrelenting. "Barricade the door!" Jake shouted, grabbing a rusted chair and shoving it against the frame. Sarah and Mia followed suit, stacking anything they could find. An overturned desk, a splintered bench, until the door was barely visible beneath the makeshift barricade. The growling grew louder, now accompanied by scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the wood, like claws testing its strength. "We can't stay here," Ellie whimpered, huddled in the corner. "It's going to get in." Jake turned his attention to the radio on the desk. It was old and covered in dust, but desperation drove him to try. "There has to be someone listening," he muttered, twisting the knobs and flipping the switches. Static crackled through the speaker, broken occasionally by faint bursts of distorted voices. "Hello?" Jake called into the microphone. "We're trapped near the ranger station off Route 12. Something's out here with us. Please, send help." The static persisted, and for a moment, it seemed hopeless. Then, a voice broke through, faint but clear enough to send chills down their spines. "Leave. You're not safe there. It knows you're inside." "Who is this?" Jake demanded. But the voice was gone, replaced by static once more. The scratching at the door stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. The group exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if the creature had left or was waiting for them to let their guard down. "We need another way out," Sarah said, her flashlight sweeping the room. She noticed a hatch in the floor, partially obscured by the cot. "There!" They moved the cot aside and pried open the hatch, revealing a narrow tunnel leading into the darkness. The air rising from it was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of earth. "Where does it lead?" Mia asked, peering down. "Does it matter?" Jake replied. "It's better than staying here." The group hesitated, but another low growl outside the station spurred them into action. One by one, they climbed down into the tunnel, their flashlights casting shaky beams against the dirt walls. The space was cramped, forcing them to crouch as they moved deeper underground. The growling above faded, replaced by the faint sound of dripping water. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, curving and twisting in ways that made no sense. Sarah's sense of direction faltered, and with it, her hope of finding safety. Then, ahead of them, Jake's flashlight illuminated something that made them all stop. A message scrawled in the dirt wall, written in jagged, desperate letters. "It feeds on fear. Don't let it see you." The words etched into the dirt wall stopped the group in their tracks. "It feeds on fear. Don't let it see you." The warning hung heavy in the air, each of them feeling the weight of their own panic. "What does that mean?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Jake swallowed hard, his flashlight beam shaking. "It means we need to stay calm, no matter what happens." The tunnel grew colder as they pressed forward, the sound of dripping water louder with each step. The air was damp and suffocating, and the narrow space forced them to move single file. Sarah led the way, her flashlight cutting through the dark, though it felt as if the shadows were closing in around them. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into a larger underground chamber. The ceiling was high, the walls lined with jagged rock formations that shimmered faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a makeshift altar, constructed from stones and covered in strange markings that glowed faintly blue. "What is this place?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. Sarah approached the altar cautiously, her flashlight revealing what lay atop it. Chris's other boot. Her heart sank. "He was here," she said, her voice trembling. "But where is he now?" Before anyone could respond, the chamber was filled with a deafening roar. The glow from the markings, the creature was massive, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Its movements were jerky, as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. The group froze, paralyzed by fear. "It's watching us," Mia whispered, clutching Jake's arm. Sarah's mind raced. The message in the tunnel echoed in her head. "It feeds on fear." She took a shaky breath and forced herself to stand tall. "Don't look at it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Close your eyes." Jake hesitated but followed her lead, squeezing his eyes shut. "What's your plan?" he asked through clenched teeth. "We keep moving," Sarah said. "It can't see us if we don't look." They inched toward the opposite end of the chamber, guided by the faint beam of Sarah's flashlight. The creature's growls grew louder, echoing off the walls, but it didn't attack. Sarah's heart pounded as she fought to suppress her terror, the sound of her own breathing deafening in her ears. As they reached the far end of the chamber, a narrow tunnel appeared, its opening just big enough for them to crawl through. Sarah motioned for the others to go first. One by one, they disappeared into the tunnel, leaving her alone with the creature. It stepped closer, its growl low and rumbling. Sarah forced herself to keep her eyes shut as she backed into the tunnel, the cold dirt pressing against her hands and knees. The creature didn't follow. They crawled for what felt like an eternity until they finally emerged into the open air. Snow fell gently around them, the forest eerily quiet. They had made it out, but the relief was short-lived. In the distance, faint uneven tracks in the snow led back toward the cabin.